Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Housing Elements and You. My name is Yahaira Ortega, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Associate for Thrive Alliance. And I will tell you a little bit more about Thrive. But first of all, I want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for making the time to meet others in this space. And I hope that you walk away with some action items, a new friend, and some food and drinks in your system. So, we will begin the program now. And like I said, drinks and food and restrooms are over there. If someone comes in and sits at your table, feel free to be the friend and let them know that there's food and stuff over there. Feel free to get up and go at any moment. The whole purpose of this event is for you all to meet each other and work on other efforts together. So my challenge earlier was to sit with somebody that you haven't met before, and I think you have done that very well. Just for FYI, we have Spanish interpretation on Zoom. So if anybody needs Spanish interpretation here in person, we have headsets. We've got everything for you. So see the people right next to us in the check-in table. We haven't met anyone that needs interpretation yet, but I will make a Spanish announcement now. Si necesita interpretación para español, puede hablar con la gente que está a las puertas de al lado. Okay, good. And we have Zoom interpretation. Miguel and Yenny from Upward Scholars are helping us through Zoom. They're an amazing program. This is a quick plug for Thrive Translation Hub, which you will learn a little bit more. You can talk to me about, but if you're a nonprofit in San Mateo County working with the community and you want to make your events more accessible, please talk to me, grab my card, grab my email, because we're offering free interpretation and translation for nonprofits through Thrive Alliance. So if you want to make your programs more accessible and want them to be in other languages, we're offering Tagalog and Spanish at the moment for our pilot program. But if there's another language of interest, we have the network built up for that. So talk with me if you need that. We will begin. So can we go to the next slide, please? Just to give you a quick overview of the program, we'll have the check-in. You've already done the mix and mingle. Then the welcome by me and my colleague, and Jeremy here next to me will give you some housing elements overview. We'll have a panel discussion and then time for Q&A. And then towards the end, there will be more time for you guys to talk with others and before you leave the program. Does that sound good? Yeah, okay. And this is not a quiet program. We're not talking at you, so we want engagement. Feel free to raise your hand, ask questions. That's what we like. Okay, next slide, please. So like I said, I'm Yahaira from Thrive, and Thrive is a membership-based nonprofit who advocate on behalf of and with nonprofits for San Mateo County. And I'll tell you a little bit about the programs that we have. Next slide, please. So one of our pillars is building nonprofit capacity, and this includes our strategic planning cohorts 1 and 2. If you're interested, you can all get involved at thrivealliance.org, and these are other ways that we build nonprofit capacity through executive peer coaching series, Thrive Resource Room. My colleague on my right, her name is Kirsten. Wave at everyone, Kirsten. Yeah, she takes care of Thrive Resource Room. If you're interested and just want to know general stuff about Thrive, she's our go-to gal. So we can go to the next slide. Then another pillar is policy and advocacy. That's me. Through here, we focus on healthy democracy, all things VOC, which is the Voter Education and Outreach Advisory Committee. Everyone's invited to. You can learn more on our website. We have other issue areas like the Children Education Thrive Action Group. That's what TAG stands for, our Arts and Culture TAG. And we also have advocacy series coming up. And what that means is we're working on a program with SBCN, who's Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits. They're the Santa Clara Thrive Alliance, right? And they're our partner organization, and we're working on this advocacy series. If you're a policy person within your organization, talk to me. I want to get you involved. And if you're looking to have policy within your organization, talk to me. we can work through that and I can get you hooked up with the advocacy training series. All right, next slide. So another pillar that we have is we build community resilience. And I have my other colleague, Ana Miscolta. Wave your hand, Ana. That's our go-to gal for all things Thrive Rise and COAD. And if you weren't aware, Thrive Rise is our emergency response initiative that we've started since Ana, and she's hit the ground running since September. And as you all can see, it's been a little bit, but she's done a lot, and I'll tell you more about the programs. If you want to get involved in anything emergency response, even if your organization doesn't work on that specifically, you're still working with community members in some way. She's a person to talk to. Another way that we do advocacy through community resilience is through our basic needs and safety net tag, which is the housing piece of it, right? And like I said, TAG means Thrive Action Groups, and we just meet on a regular. Right now, I've been working closely with HLC, Greenbelt Alliance, Jordan and the crowd, to build a housing element coalition, which you will learn more about when Jeremy comes on. I really hope that you can walk away with some next steps after this program. So this is a little bit about Thrive. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So you want to learn more. You don't know where to start. Maybe everything's a little overwhelming because Thrive does a lot. And just to let you know, we're about 6 people on the team, but it's an amazing team. And we're so excited to be here and help with everything else. You can get involved through one of our newsletters. Our Thrive Star is a general members newsletter. It'll go to almost everyone, and it'll give you the most updated things on the nonprofit sector. Thrive Weekly is a weekly newsletter telling you what's going on in the community. Our job board, self-explainable, but if you have a job posting that you want to put up, we can put that out for you. We can help you hire people through our job board. Another newsletter, the Policy and Advocacy newsletter, it'll tell you everything you need to know to get involved in all areas, whether it's housing, arts and culture. All of our TAG initiatives are in that newsletter. And of course, the Thrive Rise, which is our emergency newsletter. So get involved, thrivealliance.org. Next slide, please. The first event that I want to invite you to, and please excuse, we have a lot of stuff going on and I focus on policy. So our first event is this Environment and Sustainability Thrive Action Group event. And if you're interested in the Canopy initiative here in the community, you're invited to join them tomorrow, May 24th from 2:30 to 4 p.m. And you can find this event on our website. Next slide, please. The next 2 events will be Thrive Rise. And if you're interested in learning more, talk with Ana, who's back there. And this is our first monthly meeting to discuss lessons learned from the storms and develop goals for how COAD, the Community Active in Disaster, can support community risk reduction. So next slide. The last event is the communication and coordination between nonprofits and government in disaster. So if you want to learn how to stay plugged into this initiative, join them on Thursday, June 8th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. in person. All right, that's enough for the Thrive commercial. If you have any questions, any of us can help you with it. I want to say thank you to the community space, Jeremy and Alma, for inviting us to your home, I would say. This is such a beautiful space for nonprofits to get together and meet with others. And you know, we just don't get this. So they really spoil us by having us here. So round of applause for the community space team. They are amazing and they can tell you more about it, which Alma will, but I just want to say truly from the bottom of my heart, I am really thankful for just being in this community partnership that we have together and building some of this work through CZI. So before I move on, Alma, would you like to say a couple words about the space?
Thank you, Yahaira. Hello, everyone. My name is Alma Pulido. I'm the Community Affairs Manager here at CZI. And as you can see, this is our vision for the community space. It's really to cultivate a sense of belonging, purpose, and vibrancy through conscientious community partnerships. We launched the space in early 2020, which fast forward, where now we opened the space, really as a more trying to create a sense of a space that is transformational versus transactional. And so we decided that we would do that through community partnerships. And Thrive Alliance is one of our community partners that focus on supporting and connecting nonprofit organizations. We look forward to continued partnership. And in order to access the space right now, it is accessible to our current grantees. And our goal is to be able to open the space for usage for any nonprofit in San Mateo County. So that is to come in the future. So if you have any questions, feel free to connect with me or Jeremy, who actually manages our space, and we'd be happy to give you more information. And now I want to introduce my colleague, Xiomara Cisneros.
Yay. Thanks so much, Alma, and huge thanks to Yahaira and the whole Thrive Alliance team. We're really excited to be co-hosting this important conversation with you. So yeah, thank you for that amazing overview and introduction to all these amazing resources and benefits for the community. So yeah, I'm just gonna go ahead and quickly introduce the panelists, and to my immediate left here, we have Marianne Moes, who previously was on the city council for city of Portola Valley for 17 years and just recently stepped down. And here in San Mateo County, we're so lucky to have had her leadership and continue to have her leadership through various initiatives like serving on the Peninsula and South Bay Board and various California Democratic Party organizations. Next to Marianne, we have Nevada Merriman, who is Mid-Penn's Director of Policy. Over the last 15 years, she's had many different positions at this amazing real estate development team that's been a really great partner and leader in the region and helped contribute to over 3,000 homes in various counties. And in her free time, serves as a housing commissioner for City of Menlo Park. And then last but not least, we have Jeremy Levine, who is Housing Leadership Council's policy manager. And he just joined the team last March. We've never have guessed that because he's like Mr. San Mateo County Housing Element. And we're gonna hear a little bit more about his expertise. I did just want to quickly further introduce how CZI, I'm part of the community team, and in the community team, we have our housing affordability program, where we believe that everyone deserves a safe, affordable place to live. And that's why this conversation is so important to us, because as Jeremy will speak about in just a moment, we had a part one of this conversation when we talked more high level about housing elements. And this discussion is more about what's next in the process and how you all could get more involved. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeremy to give a quick 101 overview.
So before I jump into this presentation, just a raise of hands. Who here has actually read a housing element? I don't mean just skimmed it. I mean read a housing element, really looked at it. Who here has opened a housing element and then backed off because it's just too much and nobody wants to read that? All right. That's good. It's good to see a mix of experiences, people who've engaged with this process in different ways. I'm going to try and demystify what's happening with housing elements. And for those of you who might have seen our event last year, I guess it was that long ago, you're going to recognize these next two slides because I'm just repeating them from that one. So you know, engage, marinate in the deja vu if you've seen this before. To start us off, a housing element is a long document. It's 500 plus pages most of the time. But within all of that jargon, all of that text, there is a story. Cities try to understand their housing needs, the constraints to meeting those needs, the fair housing issues, and they are required to present data and actually try to tell the story of what is happening within their borders, what is happening with housing locally. It's also a vision, because after the city does all of this analysis, after they try to understand what the housing needs of the community are, they have to actually choose a set of sites And on these sites, they need to project housing is going to be built at different levels of affordability to meet the needs of the community. And those sites are just numbers on paper. It's a vision, it's an idea, but on their own, it's honestly pretty meaningless. You need the last part of the housing element, the plan, in order to make it really come together. And that's this third part of the housing element. It is a set of policies and programs. That's really just jargon for specific ways that the city is going to change law to remove the barriers to housing being built and provide incentives to housing being built that the community needs. This process is, the housing elements are big, they're intimidating. At the end of the day, they're a little more straightforward than they might seem because they're really just a tool. They are something that gives us leverage to ask cities to do more, ask counties to do more than they ever have before to actually plan for housing to meet the needs of all residents. So we can move on to the next slide. Housing elements have changed. This process has been around since the 60s, but for most of the history of housing elements, they were a voluntary exercise, useful for planning for housing when cities chose to use them to plan for housing, but voluntary. So most cities didn't take them very seriously. And even the cities that might plan for housing in some ways clearly were not meeting the housing needs of their communities because housing prices have been rising almost everywhere in our area for decades. So in 2017, the process changed. It became much more expansive. The state passed a series of new laws, and since 2017 has continued to pass new laws, increasing enforcement of this process and increasing the requirements that govern what cities have to do. So all the stuff I was talking about, the needs, the constraints, fair housing, sites, programs, a lot of the stuff has been around for a while, but only recently has it become serious, regulated. And the State Department of Housing and Community Development, a government agency, has been given a lot of money and a lot more authority to actually enforce these rules. So that now housing elements are like a contract between the state of California and the jurisdictions within it, saying that they are actually committing to build this housing, if not to build the housing, to implement the policies that will make it possible to build the housing. And the enforcement, you can go to the next slide. The enforcement's pretty strong. This is a list of where cities are at in their housing elements, and there are two dark green cities, Brisbane and Redwood City, the cities that have been certified by the state. All those other cities, they're still in the middle of their revision process, and some of them have been working on it for years. Next slide, please. This timeline is long. It stretches back, and cities, as part of the process, have to do outreach and actually hold public hearings, communicate with their residents. As part of trying to understand what the local housing need is, they need to go out and talk to people and understand what the housing need is. They also need to collect a ton of data. So there is an indeterminate amount of time, often 6 months to a year, before cities produce a first draft of their housing elements. They then produce that first draft and have to have at least 30 days for the community to review it and give input. After that 30 days, they have to wait at least 10 days for for the city to make updates and respond to that feedback. And then after they submit it to the state, it's a 90-day review period. So this first round of review can theoretically be done in 6 months. I have never seen a jurisdiction do it that fast, though. It takes normally 9 to 18 months, depending on where jurisdictions are at. And some jurisdictions have taken as much as 2 years to try and do all this outreach. So a lot of the time, jurisdictions go through all this, but 19 of the 21 jurisdictions in San Mateo County are still in the middle of this process. You can move to the next slide, because after you finish that 90 days up at the top, the 90 days maximum, your housing element can get rejected. The state does not have to accept the programs that you propose, and the state is not accepting the programs that most cities propose because they're not good enough. They're not actually demonstrating that they have the capacity to overcome 50 years of blocking new housing and actually meet the needs of the communities. So cities are trapped in this next period. You can just hit the button, it's a transition. they're stuck here in a loop where they're just going around, they're getting feedback from HCD, making revisions. The revisions are often just not enough. They're not making good plans to build housing, and then HCD is sending them back to the drawing boards. And so here we are in this indeterminate period where 19 cities have an uncertain timeline. Next slide, please. The things that cities need sound abstract and confusing, but it's actually pretty clear the policies that get a city certified. Two parts. First, you can just hit the transition. You gotta be able to demonstrate that you can produce new housing at a range of affordability levels. And producing new housing is not rocket science. You need zoning that makes it possible and legal to actually build things. If you want to make housing that's affordable, you need money and land. And if you want to get any housing built at all, you need an entitlement process that makes it predictable and consistent for you to bring a proposal that complies with the rules and in a timely fashion have your development move forward. So production is pretty fundamental to the housing element. That's the core of the whole process since its outset. There is a second part. You can click that transition again. Fair housing. This is a relatively new requirement. It's only been around since 2018, but it is expansive and covers a lot of the priorities that we might have for a housing element that go beyond production. So that means protecting tenants. That means helping special groups with special housing needs, like people with disabilities or farm workers or large families. And it also means actually planning for housing in high resource areas. And this is where fair housing and production connect, because we in San Mateo County have actually banned affordable housing in like 80% of our land. You literally could not build it in the residential land because the zoning doesn't allow it. You can't just build affordable single family homes. You need to have density. And so San Mateo County has a lot of areas with great schools, great environment, perfectly buildable, flat, no environmental constraints, but you couldn't build affordable housing there because it's not allowed. So they have to allow housing in high resource areas. This is the secret sauce that jurisdictions can use if they want to comply with the law. So next slide, just well, actually, I guess that's the end. So hopefully you get the sauce. Now we're gonna talk about how you can help cities make that sauce, I guess.
Don't be shy about grabbing some more. Thank you so much. But yeah, that was a really great overview. Thanks so much, Jeremy. So we have a few different perspectives on this panel. We have the elected officials perspective and appointed person / developer. So you have like two hats you're wearing there, Nevada, and the advocate. So it'd be really great to hear from each of you about the housing element work you've done in these various capacities. Why don't we start with the advocate, Jeremy?
I'll just shout at everyone. So my job with HLC over the past almost year and a half now has been to review every housing element in San Mateo County and provide jurisdictions feedback that will help them comply with the law. All those ingredients I just showed you, I've been looking at every housing element and telling them exactly what they could do in order to provide those ingredients. And the goal from the start has been to help cities do a good job planning for housing on their own. We are trying to work with cities as a partner, helping them plan for housing. So our job has been to support the work of local communities and help them do a good job.
Sure. So when I started at Mid-Penn Housing almost 16 years ago, believe it or not, it was not a plum assignment to be asked to track the housing elements in San Mateo County. I was the most junior member of the development team, and they were like, go out there. And there is a role, you look at stakeholders and there's a whole list that jurisdictions are supposed to reach out. So they would usually have a couple workshops, and we would go and make some suggestions. The policy aspect is really important. At the beginning of last year, I published a set of case studies, and it's about 12 projects that really wouldn't have happened if a particular policy wasn't adopted. And the ways that the cities did that was through their housing element process. So that's something maybe you can circulate after this if folks haven't seen it. And you might be surprised because some of those projects are 40 or 60 units. And in today's environment, because of the 2017 legislative package that really made it easier to build more, that might not seem like a lot, but in whatever context you're looking at it, it's a housing element. It's a bubble of where you're operating in. And when you move certain policies out, you just expand that bubble to make it a little easier to do something. So it can really unlock sites. And then also, just because a site is listed on the appendix does not mean that it's actually buildable. It doesn't mean that it's actually controllable. So to the extent that a site that either we already controlled or one that we're working with the city to develop, we like to see if there's an opportunity to actually put that site into the housing element, because it greatly accelerates the pace at which you can start to do the entitlement work. It cuts down on the risk, and it's probably going to happen, like it's real. So, you can identify a site that's owned by a private seller that's in a perfect place and totally financeable, but if they have no intention of selling it, it's really not going to happen. So trying to find those sites that really seem like they really have a shot at getting done. So site analysis, technical analysis when it comes to those actual sites is another role that we play. And we're always interested. So if any of you have a great site, let me know.
Before we hand over to Mary, I'm just curious, in the before times, before 2017, what were some interesting sites that you heard of that were designated, or any of you? I don't know if anyone wants to answer that question, but.
Yeah, sure. So many of you probably have seen the Facebook campus right when you cross the Dunbarton Bridge. And there are two long sites to the north of Willow that MidPenn acquired with the help of San Mateo County in the 80s. So these were folks that are all extremely low income. And we knew, because it was 1- and 2-story buildings really spread out, that would be a great site to do a redevelopment where we would essentially build a little bit taller and greatly increase the number of units on the site. When we acquired it in the 80s, it had already been in operation for 25 years. So we would say those homes were functionally obsolete and in need of a redo there. So by getting those sites on the housing element, all these years later, if you drive on Willow Road, you'll see that the construction's happening. Well, the first phase is complete. The second phase is under construction. And so that was in that era, and I think things have changed a little bit, but in that era, a general plan amendment for a standalone project in Menlo Park was a non-starter. It wasn't going to happen. They don't have the staff capacity. They don't have the political will to move that forward. So by working with the city to identify those sites, it not only allowed for the density, but it made it happen, period.
Hi, I'm Marianne Moise, and as Xiomara explained, I served on the Wautola Valley Town Council for 17 years, stepping down in December of 2022. I can't speak for all the cities in San Mateo County, but over the past 5 or 6 years, Wautola Valley faced an organized movement to block housing, the consequences of which created dozens of public record acts that taxed our small staff, the threat of lawsuits, one of which we settled and another in play, fear mongering about the public safety risks from possible wildfire and earthquake, ongoing personal attacks on council members and staff, and an election that completely changed the tenor of the council. The old council, of which I was a member, believed in the promise of building a diversity of housing types at lower price points to create a more inclusive and vibrant community. And we held the line, we pushed through, and we produced a draft housing element that Jeremy called one of the best in the county, given our demographics and history of exclusionary housing policies. However, the new council that includes 3 new members elected in November 2022 was of a different mind, and in my opinion, catered to the most strident anti-housing voices in the community, holding meetings that stretched until midnight or 1 a.m., sending our housing element back for numerous revisions, missing deadlines, exhausting our staff, 4 of whom quit in the first 4 months of the year, running up the consultant bills, and putting the town for the first time in its history in dangerous financial waters. Until finally, the silent majority rose up and advocated for affordable housing and the adoption of the housing element. And on May 9, it was adopted unanimously. We are an interesting case study because unlike the other small affluent cities in the county, we are a rich white town that really tried to do the right thing, taking a proactive stance on housing years before RENA 6 forced the issue. For more than a decade, we proposed projects that were shut down by the neighbors, each neighborhood rising up, organizing, and making it impossible for us to go forward. We produced a housing strategic plan. For 3 years, we worked on a committee surveying every single property in town to see if it could accommodate affordable housing. And during that time, we met with all the large and middle employers in town and the churches, encouraging them to build affordable housing on their properties for staff. But then in 2017, which I guess is when the state started to lower the boom, Stanford also came forward with their plans to build 37 faculty homes and 12 below market rental units on a very large, I'm talking 75 acres, piece of property they own in town. In response, an organized community group emerged to oppose the project. And they have been at the heart of our troubles. Of note, one of the co-founders was elected to the council in November 2022. At roughly the same time, devastating wildfires started popping up all over California. In 2020, the CZU fire burned just miles from Portola Valley, giving the Anti-Housing Coalition a material argument to oppose adding another 250 units in town. But still, we persisted. In 2021, the council appointed a band of community members to an ad hoc housing element committee, and they publicly met more than a dozen times. This culminating in an intensely detailed recommendation for programs and sites for our housing element that would actually produce real housing as well as comply with state law. So in late summer 2022, we submitted our draft housing element. Then there was an election. A well-financed PAC formed to defeat the 3 incumbents, including yours truly, but only one of us ran for re-election. The incumbent lost by 40 votes, ushering in a new era in Portola Valley town government in which furthering fair housing in Portola Valley was no longer a shared value. And that's where we are now.
Thank you. That is a great overview of the saga of Portola Valley that continues, and I'm so glad that the housing element, the hard work that you put into it, is finally moving forward. And it sounds like there continues to be challenges, like you mentioned, how powerful this, let's just call it as it is, a NIMBY group. So I'm wondering, you spoke to that and a few other challenges, but I don't know if you want to raise any others. You mentioned like Portola Valley, I looked it up, it's like a population of 4,000 or something. It's a teeny, yeah, it's very small. So like capacity,
9 square miles, 4,500 people.
Yeah. So I don't know if you want to add any more to that about the challenges, or anyone else on the panel who wants to speak about the challenges when trying to put together, equitable, good housing elements and getting that through.
All of us or just me?
You can start off, yeah.
Well, I will expect organized opposition to one of our town-owned sites on Alpine Road. once the RFP goes out, that will be ugly. We're awaiting the new fire code, which could throw a wrench into some of our sites. I'd say long-term, the two major issues are funding, since land's so expensive, and our organized opposition, including CEQA lawsuits. We have one pending right now, and there is a chance it could be successful, which is why I think there should be a legislative fix such that in almost all cases, housing elements are CEQA exempt. And I have spoken with my colleague here, and she says there is legislation to make 100% affordable housing projects CEQA exempt. Another thing that we're seeing in the cities is something called self-certification. So this is a new tactic. Cities actually have this process in the code. And in the old days, if HCD sent no comments within your 60 days, towns and cities could self-certify that their housing elements were in substantial compliance with the state housing law. But now cities are using it to hedge their bets, like let's self-certify to cut off builder's remedy. It's never been tested in this way, and it's not clear how the courts are going to rule, but they will certainly look at how close the city is to compliance with the first round of comments. In Portola Valley, we did a detailed review before self-certifying because we believe we are very close. And I was very surprised to hear that 21 Elements, do you guys know what 21 Elements is? They've been hired by the county to assist all the cities in San Mateo County with their housing elements. They encouraged self-certification as a tool. But as Jeremy reminded me the other day, until your housing element, a housing element is not in compliance with the law until HCD says so.
Did anyone else want to chime in on that, or?
Yeah, I was trying to find the bill number, but probably Jordan can help me out.
Just shout it out.
On the Alvarez 100% affordable housing CEQA exemption. I think it's AB 14 something. We'll get that for you. What's it? See, look. Thank you, sir. Yeah, so there is upcoming legislation that may help with some of these. I think if we're going back to the root question of challenges, it's really, development is about problem solving and connecting the dots along the way. So I think the affirmatively furthering fair housing challenge has been adopted in some communities better than others. I keep going back to my home city of Menlo Park, but when their housing element was first adopted, they put all 5 sites in the north part of town, which is, depending on how you want to say it, either east or north of 101. It's in one of the lowest performing school districts in the state, albeit managed by very passionate, excellent folks. So want to give them the credit that is due. And they're cut off from so many of the wonderful amenities and benefits from the rest of the city. And so we've seen that time and time again. The cities will take potentially some of either the worst sites or the sites that are furthest away from the R1, the single family home zones communities. And I think anyone would look at that and say it's just not fair. So I think a challenge now is to look at some of these sites that are actually wonderful housing sites. You can see up and down the peninsula, parking lots are being turned into housing. Downtown San Mateo is under construction. Lot 12, right next to Mountain View City Hall, is expected to start construction, and it's one in Burlingame as well. So it's not actually hard to find the housing sites, but it is still hard to find an ability and the vision at the city level to put those pieces together, to do a little bit of the preliminary work to say, okay, we want to do this transformation and it will be change. Neighbors will have to adapt to more people. Potentially businesses might have to adapt to a parking structure where their patrons are parking instead of right on the street, right next to their building. And a lot of these sites on the peninsula are either they have issues, okay? Like all of our sites have issues, either, low levels of contaminants. My home site lives above a a known contamination plume. So all of us have this, but when we're doing our projects now, they're under incredible scrutiny, and single family homes are regularly built to standards and on sites that are far worse than the ones that are affordable are on. And yet it's used as this tool for kind of stalling the process there. So I think that's a big issue. And then just going back to the vision of cities, I think, you know, Redwood City did this really well, just very close to here on Bradford, where they acquired a site over time. They had some community needs that they wanted to see met, including a childcare center on the ground floor, a revetment of a creek that had been daylighted. That's part of a bigger plan to have a walking path through the city. But they knew that they wanted senior housing. They went out and they RFP'd it in a particular way because they were looking for something particular. And I think when you have the community outreach that's already done by the city, the political support, so that the concept is kind of sketched out already, you're going to get better responses. And you would have already kind of given the developer a leg up with your neighbors so that they know it's coming and they know that the city thinks that it's a great project. So thank you to Redwood City and to any of you who work for cities. The vision part is really important.
On the political side, it's kind of two dimensions. So complying with state law requires cities to actually do a good job planning for housing. They need to deliver those ingredients I showed you. And on one hand, a lot of cities, their staff, their city council members, their publics do not understand that those ingredients are what they need. So they don't realize they need to rezone if they want housing to be built, or that it's not okay for getting your permits to take 5 years, that kills projects or scares them, or that it's just at a certain point impossible to provide unlimited community benefits. There's only so much that a developer can actually do. And so the ingredients that are necessary to make development possible are often just not understood by these jurisdictions. So providing the basic information is really important. A second part of this is that even when jurisdictions know what they need to do, and most city staff know how to make it easier to build housing. This is their jobs. They work with housing. But even when they know what to do, they don't feel like they have the political support. And there are some interesting examples of both of these cases. Like San Mateo is a good example of a city that has consistently, I mean, they seem befuddled by what HCD is asking of them. And I think their staff are trying really hard to comply with the rules, but they just don't understand the constraints that are making it harder to build in San Mateo. In Atherton, the district, the city that you'd least expect to build housing, their council realized they needed to change their zoning, and their council and then their planning commission both made proposals to change their zoning. And 200 people showed up in person at a meeting to protest the zoning changes in some form or another. And so even though the council knew they needed to change the zoning, they backed down, because what do you do when the mob shows up? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a big, important strategy of ours is investing in narrative. And there's a great regional effort, Shift the Bay, and also CZI. We support statewide investments on the research and message testing that's needed to really change the hearts and minds of how folks view housing. But like, yeah, it's just your point. It's important that we continue to beat that drum and really elevate the importance of housing and affordable housing for all. So I know, I think we're running up a little bit on time, but I just wanted to squeeze in one more question here. I know there's a lot of cities that have yet to be in compliance, 19 out of 21, but let's just pretend that they're all of a sudden zooming to the finish line. Then what? How do we actually get these housing elements implemented? So you talked a little bit about programs. Yeah, definitely want to hear your thoughts on that. You talked a little about this term, like the programs and the housing element. What does that mean? And what does it mean for the folks in this room and when they're trying to track these programs? Jeremy, I don't know if you want to jump in first, and then please others jump in as well. Oh, you go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I looked it up before we came, and 17 of the sites in our pipelines are identified on housing element sites. So that means that 17 projects in the 11 counties where Mid-Penn works are that much further along. So how do we, like, that's the number one way that we use it, is that, and then in terms of policies, you can see these are hyper local, but all of them really help. So Sunnyvale allows for park impact fees to be waived. And in our 2 Sunnyvale projects, the park impact fees alone are $5 and $6 million. So it brings down the cost of development significantly. And that's making a personal, if you call a city a person, they've decided that the community benefits of affordable housing are so great that they don't also have to extract this additional very high fee from it. So policies like that, where that gets baked into the general plan. There's also policies related to reducing the number of parking stalls needed. And that means that when we go and put a project in for to start the planning process, we also have to write a letter that talks about the concessions that we're asking for. So the state has a density bonus law. It allows you to go up to 35% over what you're zoned for. And then there's other laws that overlay on that that may even help you achieve a higher density. And it allows you for the 3 concessions. Sometimes we don't even need the density, but we always need the concessions, because when you add those extra units, you can expect that some of the other requirements for the city are going to need to be modified. For instance, if it's a small site, we might not be able to, produce 80 square feet of a balcony space for every, or of open space on the site as well, or it's just not going to fit. So we take these concessions very seriously. And if you bake in some of this stuff into the plan, then we don't have to blow one of them on something, and we can use it for something else that's actually really where the public really doesn't like it. And that's amazing, because the concession gives a lot of cover to our political friends and say, well, they can ask for whatever 3 concessions they want. Like, let's focus on the other things that are at our discretion. So we would usually place some of the easier things to make the findings on beyond that. So those are two some of the ways that we're hopeful and continue to be excited about.
Well, I'll say, a lot of these housing elements are not finished yet. So there is room for everyone here to help local jurisdictions finish their housing elements. And of course, you could get into the weeds, read a housing element, become an expert, propose policies, but that's not accessible for everyone. The fact is that your city council members do not hear very much from people who say, I am okay with a building being taller, or I am okay with the building having less parking. So if you write the simplest, most basic affirmative statement of support for a thing, most cities don't hear, I want affordable housing next door to me. Like, just say that what your values are and the things you support, that is enough for the council member to potentially feel like they can support a more ambitious policy in the housing element. Now, there are some cities that have finished this process, and hopefully soon, more of these cities will have finished this process. And I know my presentation was a little harsh, but the fact is that more and more cities are moving towards certification. There are a lot of cool policies that cities have in their housing elements in San Mateo County, even if they haven't gotten approval yet. And once cities are certified, then it's a game of holding them accountable to actually following through on the commitments they've made. Because a housing element is not a package of policies that have been passed. It's a package of commitments to implement policies one day. And so one thing you can do as a regular resident is check in on your local housing element every 6 months and be like, any deadlines coming up? Or email your city council member and be like, hey, what are the housing element things that you're doing this month? And just make sure that this is on their radar, because every 2 years you're going to have an election and you're going to have some new city council person, and they're not going to know about the commitments that the city has made. And even the council members that have been there for a long time, it's a staff-driven process. They're largely just signing off on the ideas their staff come up with, or that they direct their staff to come up with. So it's just useful to have community members who are vigilant and who are actually looking. And again, this is the part where it's not complicated. There's a list of programs and they have deadlines on them, and you can see if the deadlines have blown by or if they didn't really follow through on the promise.
Thank you. I think the takeaway here is like, make sure your city council and planning board members know that you're watching and that you're paying attention. Are there any questions from the audience, either on the video or in live? Yeah, here, I'll come over to you. Oh, you sure?
Thank you. Thank you so much, panelists. That was really excellent. I really appreciate all of your remarks. I have a comment and a question, and my comment is, I actually just happened to listen to the podcast with California State Senator Scott Wiener, the New York Times, where he talks about how California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, has become such a barrier to building more affordable housing units. And that really, it really hit home when I listened to that, because I work at Puente, 25-year-old community-based organization in Pescadero, and we have been advocating for more affordable housing units, particularly for the migrant farm workers. And we were very glad to see the latest, the HCC's review of the county's housing element where they specifically talk about the need for the county to analyze the racial ethnic areas of concentration of poverty and the racially concentrated area of affluence. So how they really like zoning on the racial equity issue when we're talking about housing element. But my question for the panelists is that, when we are talking about affordable housing or housing justices in coastal communities, we keep running into this narrative about we have to protect our environment, like pristine coastal, our communities. We care about aesthetic values, and we are concerned about endangered species and whatnot. So what would be the most effective strategies for us to push back against the narrative that is largely being repeated, frankly, by white folks and not necessarily immigrant communities? And because most of the migrant farm workers don't speak English, and many of them don't have a legal status, so we are really in some way the only ones who can speak for them, based on the conversation our community organizer or policy associates have. So, but we don't know. I don't have the clear answer. So that has been the main reason, one of the main causes of our frustration. So how do we push back against that narrative of we have to be environmentally conscientious, we don't want more developments, or does it always have to end in legal battles or litigation?
Man, I think everybody here can tell horror stories about CEQA. Does anyone want to, yeah.
Well, I think what you bring up is that even a housing element like this doesn't really give you the green light in certain areas. So you're overlaid by the Coastal Commission, and that is pretty tough nut to crack in terms of political advocacy. You have people from the very top of the state to the bottom of the state. Supervisor Groom represented us for the longest of times, and that has, with her stepping down, means that our area has lost that representation for the time being. There are ways I'd be happy to talk to you about trying to advocate for affordable housing on the coast. I think it's usually put in the context of coastal access, which frankly is a little disturbing, because that's as though, my family needs to have access to the coast, or people should be able to live there in order to take part of the leisure elements of the coast. And it really is faulty, because there's obviously an important agricultural community there that needs to be supported. So every couple of years that local coastal plan does come up, and that might be an area of advocacy and try to change the framework there a little bit. But in the meantime, I think it will continue to be a problem. And the only strategy I have on the chipping away or working with CEQA is that we don't have all the money that's needed to fix the damage that's out there. So private developers actually, like on my last project, I closed ahead a $2 million remediation budget. So to the extent that it gets shut down, it stays the way that it is right now, which is not good. So if you're able to find a path forward that does actually offer some benefit of cleaning up, but maybe not put a single project on the hook for way more than any one project should have to carry, I think you do have in some audiences, you would have a bit of a pragmatic stance to say, okay, well, in developing, we can actually address some problems that are impacting the whole community.
I'm very familiar with this problem. And I have always said that providing housing for everyone and preserving the environment are not mutually exclusive. You can do both. And I always remind people when we have a lot of environmentalists, and in fact, I was elected as an environmentalist by the environmental community in Portola Valley in 2005. And when I started emerging as a housing advocate, probably about 2012 or 11, I actually lost a lot of friends and I lost a lot of supporters. But housing is just as important as preserving the environment, and you just have to keep saying it.
Well said. And building housing helps the environment, especially infill housing. And I think more and more we're hearing from in the media and even the governor saying that CEQA has been abused, and that wasn't the intent of CEQA. So I don't think you're alone in your corner, luckily. Are there other questions from the audience?
Hi, I see hands up. So there's someone here, but there's one
you
question
for
from
your help.
Zoom. So I'm monitoring the Zoom, and I encourage everyone online, if you have your questions, put them in the chat. I will read them out loud for everyone. The first question here that came in through Zoom. So we'll alternate a little bit. We'll go with Zoom and then in person as well. You'll be next. Okay, so everyone here, I know there's different sides to everything, but one of our members is wondering if you're optimistic about the current push for the more affordable housing and how likely it is to succeed. It sounds like all of you are in this space. We have to be optimistic, but they want to hear your perspective on it.
I mean, to be a developer is to be an optimist. And we need money. So this is great because the sites are being identified and we're not going to be able to build anything without more money. In 2024, there'll be 3 important measures on the ballot that all relate to housing: lowering the voter threshold for infrastructure improvements to something that is more democratic. Right now, you have to get to 66.67% in order to invest in something that's undemocratic, to have 65% of people say yes to something and not have it pass. Ridiculous. That will be there. And, you know, don't let the jargon fool you. That's directly tied to be able to pass a statewide bond for housing and a regional bond for housing. So we are optimistic that the voters will continue to say that housing is a top issue in the Bay Area and is worthy of our support.
I mean, cities have not built very much housing in the last 60 years. So in the last 5 years, cities have done more than they have for most everyone in living memory to make it easier to build housing. The history of housing in California for the last 60 years, up until 2015, 2017, was making it harder to build housing. So yeah, it's exciting to see the politics around housing slowly shift. We are really far from the progress we need to be. And though this housing element process has given the state more authority to work with cities to make it easier to build housing, cities are still doing all kinds of things that make it really hard to build housing and kill housing. And in any city, you need a lot of things to align for housing to work. You need the council to be on board, you need the staff to be on board, you need the community to be on board, because any one of those can basically exercise veto power by just delaying things long enough and gumming up the works that projects can't move forward. So I'm optimistic that things are changing, and I'm realistic that they haven't changed nearly as much as the opponents of change would make you think. We've got a long way to go.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this conversation. It's an important conversation, and your advice on how people can become advocates is really important. So thank you very much for that. One of the issues about having enough money to build affordable housing is the concept of public land being used for public good. And this was one of the subjects of a recent Affordable Housing Month topic. And so my question is, what is the status of having a legislative response to the need for any public land to be first used for affordable housing?
If you're thinking about the Surplus Land Act, it is a good concept, but really hard because it's really the first, it's an option. And in many cases, it would be hard to exercise that option at that exact moment. Does anyone else have a response? Personally, I like to look at the housing index appendix at the end and then just do my quantitative nerds back at the house help me with this, and young folks just getting out of school, bright and shiny housing nerds, and we look at all the sites and we identify which ones are at least 3/4 of an acre and which ones are publicly owned, because those are the ones that are likely to develop. And then we look at our high production cities. That was San Mateo, Sunnyvale, Redwood City, and we look at places that have a track record of finishing a project, starting a project, finishing one, starting one. So.
I was in a recent bike ride looking at some of the affordable housing projects that are being built, mostly in South San Francisco, were the ones we viewed. I was astounded that there were actually solutions to areas that had historically been FEMA flood zones. And one of the processes that the developers had to deal with was making the housing they built there not needing FEMA flood insurance, so taking them out of that risk category. And I'm wondering if there are technologies coming along that are going to make that developers more able to pencil that in. And same with fire risk with our, basically our whole county is up against a wildland fire risk. Are there mitigation things that can make those locations more safe and usable for housing?
So the flood risk question is pretty interesting, but to keep it short, there's two things that you can do. And one of them is if you're in one of these areas that's kind of iffy, is you design around that. So you don't put units on the ground floor. It's called wet floodproofing, if you can imagine that. And so mitigating for the circumstances through the design is a pretty common practice. And then we have Measure K here in San Mateo, the half-cent sales tax measure that passed in 2016. And environmental resiliency at the whole county level has a lot to do with this, because it does impact certain sites and will prevent them from being in that 100-year floodplain with various types of infrastructure that we're tackling together, not each city, but together. So I expect that will continue to bear fruit, and you can kind of check it out every couple of years when they do their budgeting process, kind of what's been prioritized. And we all need to continue to do that, not just because of affordable housing, but many of us live in places that might not be right next to the bay, looking at Kathleen and the Willows, where certain creeks regularly are at risk of overflowing. So that's one where I feel like should have broad base of support, because many homeowners, myself and my whole neighborhood included, constantly have to pay flood insurance. That's going to be something we can solve together, I think.
I can talk to fire because Portola Valley's in the WUI That's the wildland urban interface. We passed one of the strictest building codes for fire in the county. We work very closely with fire department and CAL FIRE, and there are a lot of new technologies coming. The new homes that are being built are fire resistant materials. There is a huge push to manage land. For example, I live on a canyon on 3 acres, and I am working on clearing 200 feet down. I have had firefighters at my house saying, if you do this clearing, you can defend your house. It can be done, absolutely. There was one other thing I was going to mention. We're also way better on evacuation, know your zone, that whole thing. So I do feel that we can mitigate to a certain extent around fire. Certainly, there will be the odd fire that will come through that's just going to burn. And there are places you should not build, but it's possible.
Can wrap up this question just by saying San Mateo has this, east of 101, there's a lot of it's a flood zone. West of 101, you get into the hills and there's a high fire zone. There is this sweet Goldilocks zone that is flat, super buildable, no environmental constraints at all, and mostly single family still. Mostly still does not allow density or affordability. So I think it's a question of, will San Mateo take advantage of the land that it has and make it possible to build affordable housing in the easy places? And then we can worry about some of the harder ones later on.
Yeah. By the way, it sounds like you want to get involved with Thrive Rise. So please get involved. They're working a lot of mitigation. Yeah, I know you heard the Thrive commercial, but your question was on point. They're exploring different housing tactics when earthquakes hit and things like that. And there's a new bill up in the legislature. So get involved. Anna's not here, unfortunately, anymore, but I'll give you my card and come by. Just come to a meeting and figure out if that's your interest. Thank you.
So I know there's no question and that we're moving on to the next part, but I do want to say that I think this conversation's been really helpful for me to hear perspectives like yours in terms of how to work through some of the environmental constraints. And although it hasn't been brought into the conversation explicitly, I think one additional place where advocacy is needed and where just want to lift it up before we close out is that upzoning isn't really seen as a plus for everyone, not just the NIMBY folks, but also certain neighborhoods that have a real threat of displacement. And so those are the areas in particular where sensitive advocates can look to add policies that can make sure that either there's reinvestment in the commercial parts of those neighborhoods, that if there are certain sites that are built at density, that potentially there's a neighborhood preference to come back to that. And there's also something called affordable housing overlay zone, but there's a suite of protective policies that we haven't really touched into on this conversation. And it's really related to, if you want to call it either transit-oriented development, or last week I heard community-oriented transit, which I like a lot more. But just that might be something as a follow-up to we could look into. Thanks.
So we're gonna thank you so much for staying over a little bit. I know we're a little bit past the program end time, but I really appreciate you elevating that point, because housing elements, we think of production, and especially with AFFH, affirming further fair housing, which Jeremy's touched on. This is an opportunity to also elevate the need for tenant protections and prevent displacement. So thank you so much. And 30 seconds or less, each panelist, what's your final call to action? So that's what's in between the audience and their last swig of beer, alcohol, and their snack before going to home for dinner.
3 points. First, elections matter. Vote for candidates with a proven record of supporting affordable housing. Second, cultivate a relationship with your local reporters and do what all the youngins in here do so well. Broadcast news through your social media platforms. Jordan is a master at this. And for example, this is a really quick one. When Woodside decided to declare its entire town a mountain lion habitat, that was blasted throughout social media, and within a week, it was nipped in the bud. And last, show up at council meetings and make your voice heard. If you don't agree with the council saying, offer an alternative, send letters to all the council members, always CC the city clerk and/or town manager to get it in the record. When the silent majority rose in Portola Valley to finally speak up, it made a difference. As someone who sat behind the dais for 17 years, I can assure you there is power in numbers. Speak up, stay engaged.
So for me, it's really about looking at what each of you bring to the conversation. So housing has a whole set of associated priorities. So when we can work together to lift those all up, I think that we strengthen our community fabric. We move beyond talking about arena cycles and units. We talk about people's homes and how we want to live together here in community with dignity and mutual respect.
On your tables, you have a really cool petition that you can sign if you want to support all of the things we've been talking about. This petition is part of an effort to support better policies in the housing element for San Mateo County. So that's the county, not all of the cities. It just covers unincorporated areas, but the county is the largest source of subsidy for affordable housing for pretty much all of the jurisdictions. So their housing plan has a really big ripple impact. And if you sign up for this petition, you're going to get news alerts, you're going to get meeting reminders, you're going to have the opportunity to plug in directly to what the county is doing with its housing plans. And you'll also get some information about other organizations, local city organizations that you can participate in if you want to plug into what they're doing on the housing element. Because the best way to review a housing element or get involved in a city council meeting is with your community, new friends. So yeah, plug into what HLC is doing, plug into what the other local housing organizations are doing. We'll help you do it.
Well, that's a wrap. Thank you so much. Let's give a huge round of applause to all our panels and Xiomara. Thank you for hosting this. I really appreciate you all for showing up, being part of this movement. You know how to get involved now. And if you don't, talk to one of these people. Thank you so much for showing up. We have about 30 minutes. If you want to stay and linger and get some more drinks and food, that's okay.